Sorry about that. Sure, thanks, George, and welcome everybody to our panel, Sound and the Politics of Assembly. And we're just going to go ahead and get started with George Lipsitz, who's agreed to make some introductory comments, and then we can all introduce ourselves one by one. If you want to hand it back to me then, George.
Yeah, well, welcome everybody. This is a session on sound and the politics of assembly. And it's of course no ordinary time to be talking about that topic. Over the past few years, but especially the last 6 months, all around the world, masses in motion have been crying and speaking and singing and shouting in the streets, insisting that freedom needs to be heard as well as seen. It can't just be known and felt, it needs to be experienced. And this, of course, builds on the long tradition of aggrieved peoples everywhere who have always used sound as a way of conveying the things that words can't say. The great New Orleans Ninth Ward poet and spoken word artist, Sonny Patterson, talks about her work as a sound that can shake the trees and rattle the ground. In the novel Beloved, Toni Morrison's narrator talks about a ring shout as the sound that broke the back of words. And these sounds are tremendously important. They create what Alex Chavez and Matt Sakakeeny have called fugitive spaces of belonging and amplification. But as powerful as they've been in the past year, they've probably never been as important, but they've probably never been as imperiled either. The masses in motion have confronted the silencing effects of a pandemic that keeps people indoors and inhibits public convenings, been hit with legal repression, even murder, brutality against people trying to speak out, and of course the normal silencing done by the cacophonous noise of the corporate media, the corporate educational system that try to drown out oppositional voices. And so we meet today to talk about things that we've heard and seen, the power of sound, sonic analysis and organization as a way of refusing unlivable destinies. But on the other hand, we don't have a foolish optimism about this. We can't assume that the things that worked yesterday will be free to be implemented tomorrow. But we have to find a way, we have to fight with the tools we have in the arenas that are open to us. And remember that there are people listening and looking for what we're going to say and sing and shout and do, that we have to be accountable to a wider world, not just to the small groupings that we come from and often speak for. So the panel today, the panelists will be speaking from different perspectives. We didn't come down one road to come to this convening. We represent many different experiences and aspirations. We represent the freedom dreams of ancestors whose suffering, struggle, and sacrifice made it possible for us to be here today and have the luxury of talking about social justice and the luxury of imagining it coming into being. But their suffering reminds us that we have meaningful work to do. So I'm asking each of the panelists to respond to a couple of prompts, but this isn't like the corporate media or the court system. You're actually free to answer in any way you want, but these are prompts to get things started. And we're interested in your experience. How does sound function to enable and enhance public assembly? How does it create spaces of belonging and enable different forms of place-making, place-taking, and place-keeping? We want to know how our sonic technology is deployed, sometimes to control dissent and to make assembly impossible, as well as to enable them and to make them viable. And finally, we'd like some ideas about the future of sound-based forms of physical assembly and what are the alternatives to it that can be envisioned and enacted. And given our work, we're especially interested in the ways in which social identities are heard or sounded. And here we're riding the crest of a great wave of scholarship in ethnomusicology and anthropology that is talking about the ways in which people come to know themselves and others through sonic creativity. So I'd like to pass it on to the panelists. We can do it in any order. The order I have is we have Matt, Alex, Dylan, and Lee. Whoever would like to go first, or whoever Matt wants to call on, let's get it started.
Great, thank you so much, George, and thank you for really underscoring the luxury we have in gathering here together and raising our voices. And maybe we could go introduce ourselves in the order George just gave out. And I should mention also that our colleague Ana Maria Ochoa reached out to us today and said she won't be able to attend the roundtable, so we'll miss her today. But that will leave hopefully some time for some Q&A at the end. But let me start, if I may, with some introductory comments and hand it off, and then if we could circle back to George's amazing questions. I was thinking of gathering here at this forum of AAA that they call Raising Our Voices, and how voice there becomes a metaphor for unsilencing, for speaking back, a very common metaphor really for coming together in what Ana Ochoa described in her book as the formation of the people as a political subject. And I wanted to just say two things about that to begin our comments. Is first, that at a conference organized around or named after sound as a metaphor, ours is the only panel that deals with sound and music and sound. And I think sound itself can be muffled in anthropology, and music specifically really continues to be defanged as expressive culture, whose aesthetic and performative dimensions can appear as marginal to politics with a capital P unless they're bundled explicitly with political texts, with political lyrics, especially those about resistance. And I know that's not news to a lot of us who are doing music and sound research. I just wanted to highlight that within this larger context of anthropology, that continues there continues to be a kind of muffling and silencing of expressive culture and of music and sound. But second, and more pointedly, Alex Chavez and I invited George and everyone here today to speak on how sound organizes people in space, how it calls individuals to get information in the first person plural, we, as in raising our voices, and how that togetherness can lead to a possibility of enacting political change. And to state the obvious, quarantine and social distancing require us to re-examine this narrative at this moment, but I think also beyond the pandemic, historically and into future possibilities. As Lee asked in the abstract for today's panel, she wrote, quote, "What has changed, what remains, and what has always sat uneasily with the notion of a liberatory politics of assembly that become illuminated in their absence." So in other words, using this moment as a moment to reflect not on the exceptionality of this moment, but on what it can tell us about not only the way sound brings us together, but the way that sound can be controlled, can be the way that the state can use silencing practices and incarceration, etc., right, to contain us. Much of our research predates the pandemic. Mine focuses on a musical funeral procession in New Orleans known as a jazz funeral, and how the sound of the brass band organizes Black New Orleanians, and how Black collectives and public spaces are always inherently political in the United States of America, because they have so often been pathologized as a threat to racial orderings. And so that's what I'll be talking about when we circle back to me and get the chance to answer George's questions. But maybe, Alex, I can hand it off to you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Again, I'm Alex Chavez. I teach at the University of Notre Dame in anthropology and Latino studies, and it really is a pleasure to be here today, sort of sharing this time with my colleagues here, and kind of continue this conversation that we've been having from afar, I think digitally, mainly through sharing work and reading each other's work. And I think, having this kind of moment to really interact in real time, I think is a really wonderful opportunity. I'll echo a little bit of what Matt was speaking to. I think on the one hand, this notion of the uptake of the sonic in anthropology more broadly, and then beyond that, this kind of broader political question around sound and its connection to space. So with respect to the sort of the uptake in anthropology, I do echo Matt's thoughts here around the sort of the way that sound is relegated to a particular sort of epiphenomenal sort of kind of realm when we think about its treatment as culture, right, or cultural production, or its sort of politics, and which is ironic when we think about the theme of this sort of gathering, and that there's not a lot of treatment of that, and it's curious too, because we think of the sort of materiality of the voice, but then we also include this kind of more immaterial notion of the voice as social, right? So the I have a voice, it's I have an identity, I have a subjectivity, I have a politics, I have a position, I occupy a particular space. And that is in one way what's being called for here in terms of this sort of raising our voices, right? And so I think at that level, which is in terms of thinking through sound as an analytic, we're all clearly dealing with that and its materiality and all the rest, but I think also its resonance with respect to the work here is one that takes quite seriously the sonic dimensions of expressive culture, the kind of expressive grammar of the vernacular, and more specifically, to sort of dovetail to the second part of what Matt was saying, how does that exist in space? Or what's its relationship to space? One of the things that I've been thinking through quite a bit and continue to is clearly this connection between sound and space, but then those things are always linked necessarily. And, whereas, in my sort of ongoing work for years, and it's been sort of linked quite specifically to the sort of way particularly socially positioned listeners, in this case, Mexican migrants, own sort of connection to the particular soundings of a musical form, Wapango, Ribeño, all the rest, right? What's interesting here is that for me, that question about sort of the placial attachments have always been around how do sounds travel, how do people take sounds with them, how then do those sounds sort of places collapse, right? And you create these adjacencies. I find myself now more specifically thinking through questions around that, but in a kind of flip mirror image, because I'm working now, and I'll be speaking to this more, in the city of Chicago. So rather than thinking about multiple places, as it were, and how one particular sound connects these places, I'm now thinking about one singular place, just for the sort of sake of argument, Chicago, but how multiple sounds exist and coexist in this palimpsestual way that sort of contributes to how we listen to the city. More specifically, how we listen to aggrieved communities, or don't, or silence them, or what gets amplified, and etc. So that's in part the work that I'll be talking about today, but again, this explicit relationship to space and sound is, at least for me right now, through that particular prism. So, but I'll leave it there and hand it off.
Guess it's my turn now. Is that correct? Swelt, il talsquik, talitzel quad squa, castel alets cheatsalatzel to hodnashoni holmach equala, casta anishnabe holmach, castella oqua almach tatha. So, greetings everyone. My name is Dylan Robinson. I am coming to you today from Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory, the place that is now called Kingston, just between Toronto and Montreal, for those of you that need a little bit more geographic specificity. And I am in Halkmelem, which is the language that Stella people use. I said where I'm from, and I am from the area now called Chilliwack, just outside of Vancouver, but Squaw is the name of our territory, and we are 26 different nations and bands. We identify by the sort of larger distinction of Stalo people. So I just located myself and said where I was, and then finally I extended it outwards. I mean, these gatherings are interesting right now in terms of how do we acknowledge and talk about these places through the wires that we are gathered in. So I just extended that outwards to say those other indigenous nations and communities, across all of the lands here where you are coming from, and where these signals are traveling to. So feel free to take a moment to write those for yourselves in the comments if you feel so moved to where you're coming from. I'd love to hear that, see that. So I will be speaking today about the context of assembly from the position of working with Indigenous communities and individuals in museums and with our ancestors. And so I really appreciated George's opening call here to remember the work of our ancestors in bringing us to the place that we're at now, and that work that keeps us moving, keeps us doing this work for our future generations to come. And so we often open our gatherings by saying Equus Haquiletsit to Siwas to Sialakwash, which means let's take a moment to remember our ancestors and their teachings. And I think that's really important to sort of guide the work forward. So thank you to George for framing it in that way. When I won't say too much here, but just to say this context I'm working in museums with our ancestors. What I mean here by ancestors, and these terms are used differently by different Indigenous folks depending on where you're from, but ancestors or beings or life, what the museum normally thinks of as objects or artifacts, but we understand as having life and always being in relationship to these beings and ancestors as part of our forms of assembly. And so it's really important to recognize that, because when we think about the distancing, that we have with our ancestors who are kept by museums now, that is a form of prohibiting the continuance of prohibiting Indigenous assembly. And I won't say too much more because I'll get to that in a moment. But also just to note, in the context of sound, it's really important to remember that for many Indigenous folks, our songs are not songs. I mean, they are songs, but they're actually legal orders. They are books in the sense that they document to the same level of detail our histories in the way that a book would, with that affective and sensory side of that history represented as well. And their medicine. So they are songs, but they're also not songs. And so it's so central to think about the role that sound plays and that song plays in our in our continuance as peoples, and as a foundation for pretty much everything we do. So I'll just put that on the table and then be happy to return to talk to this in more detail when the time comes.
Hi, everyone. I've written out my introductory comments, so forgive me if I sound stilted in comparison. But my name is Veeraraghavan, and I'm the Kenneth P. Dietrich Memorial Diversity Postdoctoral Fellow in the Music Department at the University of Pittsburgh. And I want to thank you so much for your presence at this roundtable. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the implicit corollary to sound and its role in the politics of assembly, which is hearing. And without getting into the Zen koan aspect of the relationship between sound and hearing, today it seems that every statement by a politician, by a corporation, or by an academic community on racial injustice contains a reference to the importance of listening and hearing. So in a de facto sense, ideas related to sound, such as voice, place a demand on the body politic that compels a response that is required for legitimacy, at least in a liberal democracy. So I am going to explore what this means in the liberal settler colony of Canada. To dredge up a somewhat famous old anecdote, the historian Pierre Burton, who might be thought of as the Canadian institutionalist's public intellectual, once said of Gordon Lightfoot's Canadian Railroad trilogy that it encapsulated his theory of how the Canadian nation was built better than he ever could have. That is to say, the condition of possibility for Canadian nationhood was poor migrant laborers hewing a railroad out of inhospitable, empty wilderness. Of course, that quote unquote wilderness was never empty, and those kinds of stories paper over the history of dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples. But the kernel of the idea that the nation needs infrastructure to cohere as an economic unit is an important one. So today's version of the railroad are oil and gas pipelines that mark a shift from an economy based on manufacturing to one based on resource extraction. And at a time when concerns over climate change and Indigenous resurgence are at the forefront of the public imaginary, the powers that be deploy classic divide and conquer techniques using sound technology and anthropotechnologies, even as they seek to maintain a veneer of legitimacy. So I will describe how hearing processes for oil and gas pipelines are formatted to produce the settler and the Indigenous as two distinct categories before the law in ways that circumscribe the possibilities of speech, let alone hearing. And I'll be focusing on the Northern Gateway Pipeline and the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Thanks.
George, how would you feel about posing that question, the first question for us, so we can remind the audience of your great prompt?
Yeah, I will do that. And also, I should throw in that I'm research professor emeritus, UC Santa Barbara, but I'm now in the Central Coast of California. So these very important opening statements lead us to some serious questions that need to be asked and answered. And the first is we want to know how in your work you found that sound functions to enable and enhance public assembly, to create spaces of belonging, and to enable placemaking, place taking, and place keeping. And we'll throw that open. We have plenty of time, and we want to hear about your work.
Is it all right if I jump in? And I know we're going to go round robin again. I'm here in New Orleans. This is Matt Sakakeeny again, for anyone who's listening and can't see. And I'm here in New Orleans, where I teach at Tulane University, which was founded on the territories of Homa and Chitimacha people. The whole city was. It became home to the largest slave market in the South. It was the capital of the Confederacy. And in Clyde Wood's amazing portrayal of New Orleans, in his incredible book, Development, Drowned, and Reborn, he talks about a long history, an unbroken history of white power and white supremacy in this city that's inscribed on the landscapes and in the monuments to white terror leaders, that came, some of which came down in 2017, but the structure itself, he suggests, in Clyde, George Lipsitz's amazing former colleague, rest in peace, describes or encouraged us to think around the city in terms of planned abandonment, and really the notion that containment of Black New Orleanians, of people of color in New Orleans, that their surveillance, that their economic disenfranchisement and political disenfranchisement is not an aberration of American democracy, but is central to it. And my work that I wanted to talk about today is among a very a robust tradition, performance tradition within that larger context that Saidiya Hartman suggests we call the White Republic. And it's called the Jazz Funeral, and it's a musical funeral procession that departs from a church service, from a funeral service after the service, and proceeds to a grave site, typically organized by a mutual aid society, originally a burial or benevolent society that provided care for the sick and burial services for the dead, more recently known as social aid and pleasure clubs. And those processionals are led by a brass band, by trumpets, trombones, and saxophones in the what's called the front line, and then a back row of marching drums and tuba. And they begin with mournful dirges and then transition to joyful spirituals and popular songs, either after burial or at a set point. And a lot of my work has been around how these sounds, these very familiar sounds of the horns and the drums playing familiar repertoire for Black New Orleanians, organizes people into a moving collective, like a protest march, but without the explicit political discourse. The assembly is really about a type of collective affect of a shift from mourning the dead and honoring them into a joyful celebration of their life. That's the defining characteristic of this tradition. And I wanted to make a couple points about that. One that's general in terms of just assembly period is when precarious peoples, when people that society has made precarious gather together into public spaces, there is a plural enactment of a we that contests neoliberal norms of the individual who's responsible for their self-sufficiency under these conditions where self-sufficiency becomes increasingly unreliable. So if you've seen Judith Butler's great book, Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, she really stresses that the freedom to assemble precludes the freedom of speech, and the bodies assembled in her metaphor say that we are not disposable, that we cannot be silenced, whether or not there's political discourse attached to this. And beyond the general, I would say specific to Black Americans, is their exposure, the display of this particular performance tradition of the jazz funeral, or a civil rights march, or a Black Lives Matter march, is a type of public outpouring, a type of recognition, a type of claiming space that goes against a type of containment, a type of surveillance, a type of atomization, meaning seeing society in Margaret Thatcher's infamous phrase as not existent, but merely a collection of individuals. And if I might quote Christina Sharp, she argues that Black people are living in spaces where they were never meant to survive, or have been punished for surviving, and for daring to claim or make spaces of something like freedom. They yet reimagine and transform those spaces for and practices of an ethics of care, meaning repair, maintenance, attention, not to mention rebellion, right, through something like a dirge or a dance. And that brings me to two other points I want to make about sound and affect before I silence myself. One is that it is sound that calls, that invites people to assemble, and sutures them into a collective, dictating the tempo of their movements through the rhythm of dirges and popular songs, and regulating the registers of affect, of mourning and then joy, through familiar melodies and through the improvisations that New Orleans is known around the world for. And second and finally, that unlike say a protest of this summer of the Black Lives Matter movement, these are not about politics explicitly, but about the joy of coming together, of dancing to good time music, of commemorating the loss of someone that testifies to their stature within an aggrieved community, against their denigration, and honors the effective register of how the deceased lived and how they would want others to go on living, which is joyfully, right, in the face of their subjection, of our subjection. And the music is mostly instrumental. Words are not needed to articulate an explicit politics, and this creates a kind of veneer that maybe relates to the dismissal of expressive culture and of joy that I mentioned at the start, even anti-political, but perhaps this is the point, that the very prospect of assembling together, to refer back to Sharp's words, in spaces where Black people were never meant to survive, projects a politics of assembly, quite literally in terms of the 14th Amendment, the protections that came after the Civil War, meaning the freedom to assemble, as well as laws of desegregation in the Civil Rights era, and the sound of the horns, the drums, the familiar repertoire that spark dance and spark joy in those streets is inherently political, I would argue. And thanks. I'll move on.
Yeah. To I think follow up on that and to think through again these sort of articulations of sound and space and how they are pivotal in sort of enabling or enacting forms of assembly. I will again sort of suggest that or remind everybody. This is Alex again speaking here. That the context I've been looking at recently for a few years now has been the city of Chicago, and I find that work has increasingly been this meditation on the relationship between sound, race, and urban space, and so I've sort of gone down the sort of cascading sets of narratives around both the cultural poetics that Chicago has constructed about itself, and the politics of those cultural representations. In other words, there is already a model that's been set up and constructed to how we hear that city. And the sort of the subject that it imagines or hears at the center of those narratives, of those sounds, of et cetera. And so I've been working with this idea around sonic commons and in relation to clearly acoustic environments, but how sound is participating in this political question of inclusion and exclusion, particularly in a segregated city like Chicago, which cascades into questions of belonging, questions of citizenship that people have augmented clearly beyond the sort of political rights afforded by the state, but more to think through these issues of formulations that instead privilege everyday practices and dimensions of identity through which people create community and fashion certain subjectivities, such that it at least has made me really think through one spatial analytic, which is one about assembly and congregation inherently, but we can think about it beyond that, but that is the neighborhood. Chicago, which thinks of itself famously as the city of neighborhoods. And so I want to give you an anecdote, a small piece of kind of one case study that I've been working with and around in the city, and then end with kind of an example of a sort of cultural poetics here. So the very brief example here, kind of as an anecdote, I've been here in the kind of Chicagoland area for about a decade, and there have been no shortage of instances of young Black men and young men of color being shot by police. And I remember arriving here and, amidst the sort of unrest surrounding one particular shooting, people recall Laquan McDonald. It's a number of years back. I'd already been in the city a few years by then. I remember a press conference at that time Mayor Rahm Emanuel gave. And one of the ways that he prefaces to think through inequity in the city and police community relations is he said something to the effect of, well, one of the things that we love about our city is the distinctiveness of its neighborhoods, right? We love that. And so to me, I read that, as kind of always thinking of myself perpetually as someone who is not from the city and who's, I sort of interpret things a certain way that are, sort of influenced by my own experiences, just not having lived in the city. But I read that particular comment as kind of saying like, yeah, we don't mix, right? There's a distinctiveness to our neighborhoods, right? And so and that made me really think about this really lauded sort of cultural poetics and cultural narrative around the city of being the city of neighborhoods. So I was like, okay, well, so then the question becomes, well, what is a neighborhood? Who gets to define that? Or are there multiple ideas about what the neighborhood is, and how does that participate as an analytic in these larger place-making sorts of projects by activists, by residents, by city planners, by corporations, all the rest. And so in the midst of that sort of politics of urban space, and particularly now more recently these larger sort of neoliberal projects of urban renewal in Chicago's west and southwest side, where a lot of the Latino community exists and has sort of been pushed there over decades, I came to begin working with a young group of youth who work with sound design and radio. They're called the Yolocali Arts Group, and they're affiliated with the National Museum of Mexican Art. And they, they work with sound design. And part of what they do, they have a number of projects, but among them is a couple. One is the sort of sound mapping projects that they do in relation to the neighborhoods in which they live. And also what they call this project called Your Story, Your Way, which is just them speaking about their experiences in the city. And so, one question that brings up is how do these young people think through and imagine the sounds of the neighborhood that are otherwise deemed illegible or heard as noise, particularly in the projects of urban renewal? And that for them, how they hear themselves in the city sort of indexes a different social or sociocultural order, that their manner of listening, it sort of seems to me is a way of beginning to sanctify, for lack of a better term, public space in common, because it attests to deep and continued histories and experiences of settlement, of integration, of segregation, of community, right, in this perpetual, to return to Lee's language, as this perpetual processes of dispossession in the city of Chicago. And so here are these young people sort of attesting to this. And one of the things that they did this summer, one of their episodes was actually the Yolocali group did a series of episodes on Black Lives Matter, but particularly all the organizing that was happening in the city. And so I just quote them very briefly. The series opens with the youth declaring that Black Lives Matter is, quote, one of the most influential human rights movements of the 20th century, and that their own voices matter as they refuse to be silent in the face of racial terror, right? These are young people, right, sort of literally, right, broadcasting a message, right, on the airwaves, online, but sort of animating these analytics of sound and their voices, raising their voices to speak about these issues, but speak about issues of congregation, whether it's, activism and social protest, or just existing in the neighborhood. And so that's kind of how it is that they're kind of curating and intervening as well in terms of telling this sort of story, again, to use their language, their story, their way. And I had one quick bit of cultural poetics, but I'll return to that. I'll sort of move on and hand it over for now. Yeah.
All right, so I think I'm going next here, and I'm coming at this context of assembly from a slightly different angle, which is firstly the kinds of assembly that take place between human and non-human life that Indigenous folks have, these different kinds of relationships that we have, and sort of non-human life here is thought, quite broadly and all-encompassing in a way to everything, to all our relations. Which folks here, Haudenosaunee folks, have told me means, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee folks means all our everything, actually, rather than just relations in terms of, those beings we might consider to be living, like the birds and such. So that's one context I'm coming to this in terms of assembly. And the other is by the ways that the structures of museums prohibit kinship relations between human and non-human life through maintaining a separation between us and our ancestors. And so this term here, this term I'm using right now, ancestors, as I mentioned before, is the same term, used in this context of museums that folks will consider objects or artifacts. Sometimes the word, particularly on the West Coast, I've noticed the word belongings, like with the Musqueam community, belongings has been used far more frequently, which is great. But really, I'm thinking about what these forms of life in museums are, and we have different ways of talking about that. Objects that are alive, sentient beings, objects that give life, that have agency. So this is really diverse, and I'm not going to go into that diversity here. We don't really have time, but it's as diverse as there are indigenous communities, across these lands. So that's kind of the context I'm thinking of human and non-human life in. So, and by structures, really, I'm thinking here about those literal structures, the physical structures, material structures of glass and plexiglass vitrines that display our ancestors in life, and that also are considered a form of protection for those objects or artifacts, right? But really, this form of protection meant to keep unwanted hands away from damaging delicate objects is a way also of keeping our hands as Indigenous peoples from being in relationship, or not just hands, but from us being in relationship, some kind of physical relationship with our ancestors. So we encounter these not as a form of protection, but as a form of segregation. It's our hands that are kept from connecting with our ancestors and family. So museum storage and display prohibits the forms of assembly Indigenous people practice by the ongoing separation of kinship. Not only are we kept separate from our kin in terms of touch, we're also kept from singing together. So this is not just a way of saying we can't have this form of connection by singing, we can't have this lovely practice of making music together. As I mentioned earlier, since song is often the way we convey or legitimize our laws or protocol, museum segregation of our ancestors from our communities also plays a role in that erosion of legal orders or historical documentation or practices of medicine. So I'm really trying to shift this away from just thinking, that kind of practices of song that are about belonging, but really to practices of song that function in really different ways as law and medicine and historical documentation is just three of many. So what assembly means in these contexts for me then is thinking about reestablishing kinship between our non-human relations in museums, between us and our non-human relations in museums. Whether these are with our direct ancestors, those that are from our communities, or members of our extended community relationships. And I want to discuss what this means in just a second. But I want to just mention briefly that I really think it's important to shift the terms here of understanding this life in museums, because it obviously there's a traumatic impact for us, for many Indigenous folks. Going into the museum is a place where we encounter this separation from family so strongly, right? But I think what we need to understand as well, and this is just an Indigenous folks, this applies to many different cultures and groups. But when we think about the role of the museums in containing this life, I think we really need to shift the terms of engagement here to understanding museums as not offering a form of protection, but offering a form of incarceration. And I'm not trying to say that we can sort of place this full language of incarceration in relation to prisons upon the museum, but I really think that the strong language is necessary so that there's an understanding here of the extremity of this separation. So I want to shift here, and I think we had sort of divided this out in the format of the presentation, but I think I'm just going to present everything I have to say now and get it all out at once. So often, what folks, sometimes museum staff or others, will consider the right way forward to redress this incarceration with our loved ones is repatriation, and sometimes that is the right way forward. Right, it depends on the community's desire, certainly. But given the fact that many of our ancestors, these beings that were considered objects and artifacts by museums were treated by museums, and they were treated with chemicals such as arsenic many times, and have toxic traces that persist, it's actually unsafe for us to have physical contact, for us to actually reestablish these kinship relations through a direct relationship with that ancestor or being. And there are a lot of different ways that Indigenous folks have treated this, through processes of remaking, and so that's important to note here too. But another challenge of reconnecting with our ancestors and relations is that time, because you can imagine that if you were separated from a member of your family for more than 100 years, there'd be some work involved in actually, working through how to reconnect, how to actually, in the context of incarceration, what reentry or reintegration would look like, right? And I think while there are a number of examples of this happening with physical remains, the kind of ceremonial context of bringing our ancestors back to us, to our communities for burial, or these important ceremonies that need to happen, that happens less often with repatriation of these objects or artifacts. And so really one of the things that I've been emphasizing is that we should focus on what these forms of reconnection are, what these forms of assembly are, that don't presume that the end goal is always the return of a physical thing. For many of us, that reestablishing of kinship is the first, is the most important thing. And sometimes it is a combination of doing that with repatriation. But I want to say, just to close here today, that one of the ways that I've been working in this form of reconnection is by collaboration with Indigenous artists. So there are a number of folks here in Canada, Indigenous artists in Canada, that have been doing this work. Two who I have been doing this work with most significantly are Tanya Lukeen Linklater, who's Alutiiq from sort of Alaska, area now called Alaska, and Peter Morin, who's Tahltan. And I want to end by quoting a very short quote here from Peter Morin regarding a kind of sonic assembly, where he describes the challenge of hearing our relations singing behind glass, the glass of museum display. And he says that the beings that he was hearing singing, I'll just describe this through his quote here. He's talking about the beings who were singing to him. And he says, quote, "Singing, and this singing that they were doing was beyond my reach. Afterwards, I realized I'd always been hearing them sing. I wanted to participate in the making of these objects. I imagined community members sitting together, telling stories, laughing, gossiping, crying, drinking tea, and sewing these objects that connect to Tahltan epistemological history. The museum has a tendency to lose the singing." So there are museums that are doing this work, that are actually supporting. I think of, I saw Jennifer Kramer's in the audience here, and the Museum of Anthropology at UBC is doing this work of providing space to Indigenous folks to come in and lead the direction of what kinds of kinship relations, what kind of work needs to be done within that space. But I would say that often this falls back to a supporting of those structures of display, right? Ultimately our relations are still behind glass, right? And sometimes what happens is a request for our consultation about how how our ancestors and family relations
Thanks. Well, I'm up next, and I actually I'm speaking really to the second question that George posed the panel. George, do you maybe want to ask it?
Yeah, the second question had to do with how are sonic technologies deployed to control dissent and make assembly difficult or impossible?
Thanks. Okay, so I'd like to open by playing a short video clip. So what you're about to see and hear is a noise demonstration that took place on January 14th, 2013 in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is unceded Coast Salish land. And it may look like a fairly typical demonstration, but it was framed and planned explicitly as a noise demonstration by the organizers, Rising Tide Vancouver Coast Salish Territories, which was a grassroots environmental justice activist group that was active in BC between 2012 and 2016, and to which I belonged while I was doing field work.
I'm honored to be here with all of you as people in behind closed doors in glass towers try and block out the voices of the people whose their decisions affect the most.
We are fighting colonialism today!
Fuel war, fuel. And we're going to be sticking a wrench in the war machine, the colonial machine.
All right. So the occasion for that demonstration was to protest the public hearing process for the Northern Gateway oil pipeline. And that particular pipeline project, which was intended to connect the Athabasca tar sands to the northern port of Kitimat, it fell apart a few years later. That being said, the hearings were notable for the fact that while all of these hearings are required by law to be accessible to the public, all sorts of machinations went into keeping the public physically out. So the noise demo then took place as a noise demo because noise is the only thing that might potentially penetrate all of the barriers erected by the industry regulator and the police. The guidelines established for the Northern Gateway hearings were already quite stringent. So the only people who could be classed as interveners, that is to say people having a proper stake in the development who could therefore be allowed to testify, were those whose property the pipeline was slated to cross and people whose livelihoods might be affected by the construction of the pipeline. And they were required to apply for intervener status a year in advance. And testimony was restricted to the impact Northern Gateway would have effectively on their property. So by limiting the scope of the hearings in this way, any discussion of climate change or the impacts of climate change gets pushed off the table. Furthermore, interveners were only allowed to bring one companion to the hearings for support, and they were allotted 10 minutes to make their case for or against the pipeline. But what I'd like to focus on is the spatialization of the hearings. They were held in the Sheraton Wall Center Hotel in downtown Vancouver, which consists of 3 towers and a conference area or lobby, occupying the first 3 levels below the North Tower. The South Tower also consists of hotel rooms, but there's a restaurant at its ground level and conference facilities on the 3rd and 4th floors. But the Central Tower is a residential tower, and so it's completely inaccessible to people who don't live in the condominiums, with the exception of the 3rd floor, which contains small conference rooms that are only accessible through 2 narrow walkways, one from each hotel tower, which you can see in this floor plan here. Oh. Whoops, I have the wrong slide up. Okay. Yeah, so you can see that the North Tower is the one that says Pavilion Ballroom, and the South Tower is the one that says 3rd floor South Tower Hotel. But the one that says Orca Room and has those tiny little rooms, that's the Central Tower. And those 2 narrow little walkways are basically the only way that people could access the hearings that were taking place there. So, so that, of course, is where the joint review panelists heard the testimony of the interveners. And, you know, of course, the hearings are required by law to be public, but the rooms are very small. And so the public was permitted to witness the hearings from the conference area of the Westin Bayshore Hotel, which is almost 2 kilometers away, which you can see here. Oops. So it's pretty far. And then the proceedings were live streamed from the Sheraton Wall Center Hotel. So to quote Marshall McLuhan, in a culture like ours, long accustomed to splitting and dividing all things as a means of control, it is sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message. A McLuhan-esque interpretation of the Northern Gateway hearings would take seriously his idea that the content of any medium ought not to be thought of as an object in itself, but as another medium in a different form. So the content of an electric light bulb is not filaments or even electricity, but light. And the content of speech is not words and sounds, but thought. And the content of the live stream is not bytes nor fiber optic cables, but presence. So we have to be attuned to the ways in which sound technology provides a justification for the kind of technocratic control that makes it seem as though a potentially liberatory politics could be enacted when quite the opposite is the case. My broad point is that sound and the affordances it provides for a material resistance notwithstanding will never escape the problem of mediation. So this is not to dismiss the possibility that a Butlerian performative assembly can be brought into being using sound, but to emphasize that the coalitional politics that are required for assembly are still subject to the kind of divide and conquer strategies and tactics that have been used by those with power since time immemorial. So I'm gonna stop it there. Thank you.
Thanks. We have limited time left. Cesar Chavez used to say the rich have money and the poor have time, but we're so poor we only have a few minutes to go. But that doesn't matter. You know, just as jazz has no final chord, just as Mutabaruka's famous Dis poem continues in your mind long after it's recited, the things we've said today indicate what's at stake in the use of sound as a form of social assembly. All of the panelists talk about breaking down false divisions between the worthy, the unworthy, the living and the dead, the human and the other than human, the ancestor and the descendant, the insider, the outsider, the past and the present. This is alchemy. This is magic. This is the work that sound does. And it's part of the work of creating cultural forms that can be repositories of collective memory, that can be sources of moral instruction, and can be ways of calling communities into being through performance. There's no guarantee of success with this. And Lee and Dylan, Alex and Matt have talked about the enormous obstacles that are posed to humane and decent accompaniment and assembly. But on the other hand, we have testimonies in this evidence of people's refusal to knuckle under, refusal to give in, refusal to give up. There's no guarantee of success in this, but there's no possibility of accepting failure. So we need to continue to let our voices be heard, to play our instruments, to make the music, that not only projects sound outward, but as every panelist has talked about, creates new relations among ourselves. When we shout in the street in front of a hotel, when we create a new music group in Chicago, when we participate in the jazz funeral, when we challenge the exclusionary practices of the museum, we're also building the world we want to live in. We're enacting the social relations that we might envision. So I think we're at 4:15, and when your boss says you're off the clock, you're off the clock. But thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks to everybody for participating. And if we stay on the path, we'll see you down the road.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, George.
Thanks, Lee, Dylan, Alex. It's very bizarre not to see all you attendees out there, but thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.